All right, so tonight we're going to continue this study that we introduced last week. We're looking at the book of Ezekiel in the Old Testament, and it is one of the strangest books of the ancient Near East, not only of the Bible, but of all the material that has been found by archaeologists. You'll find that this is one of the most bizarre. Has different symbolism to it. It's interesting that it's not widely referenced in the New Testament as some of the other Old Testament books are. Um, and there's not a whole lot that refers to some of the hopes of the ancient people as to a coming Messiah. I mentioned last week that Ezekiel's calling and commissioning is basically to kind of reform the thinking of the people in their own belief structures. And we are looking at different sections in chapters 1 through 11. Ezekiel has a vision of God's presence, but also the bad message that the temple in Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. Then it's followed by poems and parables. And then it finally finishes off with promises of vindication and restoration for Israel. I mentioned that the theology of the day last week was centered around these four thoughts, and I didn't have this in last week's handout, but I did want to give it to you tonight. I think it really does kind of uh, come up against what the common beliefs were of Ezekiel in the day that he is called to confront his own people on their actions, and that belief structure was centered around these four things: believing that they're the chosen people, believing that God had given them land grants, believing that there's going to be a Davidic dynasty in perpetuity, and then finally they believed that David's kingly rule would be a manifestation of Yahweh's heavenly rule. And so I think what Ezekiel's trying to do is he's trying to confront them with the fact that even though they believed that this was what God had promised, they didn't hold their end of the covenant up. And as a result of that, there's bad news about the coming destruction of the city. So in chapters 1 through 11, you have a vision of Yahweh. And so if I asked you to read chapter 1 before tonight, and in this opening chapter, you're given the first vision to Ezekiel, and it's a part of his commissioning story, his calling to be a prophet rather than a priest. Remember, we said last week that he was called and to be a prophet, even though his lineage was out of the priesthood. We're told here in chapter 1, verse 3, that Ezekiel was the son of Buzzi, who was a priest, and he is now finding himself in exile. And unfortunately, the priest is the one that's delivering the message that the temple's corrupt and that God's presence in the temple is going to leave. And with all of this, this is a revelation that cannot be contained or domesticated in any way by explaining it away. And so, what you have in the book of Ezekiel is a theological crisis. And the severity of that crisis involves a lot of different components of society: political, social, economic. All of these have consequences because the temple was kind of at the heart of the city of Jerusalem and was kind of part of the core of the identity of its day. So, what we're going to do tonight is we're going to break chapter 1 down into three sections, and that's the way we're going to read it. In chapter 1, verse 4 through 28, you have this first vision of Ezekiel. Now, this vision is a part, as I said before, of his commissioning to be a prophet. And one of the things that you're going to see in this vision is living creatures and wheels and a platform and a throne. And when you were reading it, you probably got frustrated a little bit because there's no easy answers to what is being referred to. So you have a lot of guesswork here. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the most probable interpretation, and then I'm going to give you a couple of alternate interpretations of it when we get toward the end of our study tonight. So here's how I want to begin. In chapter 1, you have this vision of God, and it's a mobile vision of God in the midst of the calling of Ezekiel. And then it ends that way in chapter 3 as well. So you have a vision in chapter 1, another vision in chapter 3. And the mobility of God is quite interesting because in Jerusalem, it was believed that God dwelt amongst the temple and within the Holy of Holies. But in this vision, what you have taking place is that God is on the move and God follows that which the Spirit leads. And you're going to notice in the reading of this text that it mentions the Spirit a few different times, that God's Spirit is moving God across the cosmos and in particular within the domain of mankind. So here's how we're going to break it down into three sections. And the sections of this vision here is part of Ezekiel when he is sitting by the irrigation canal in a place called Tel Aviv. You were told that in chapter 3, verse 15, that this is the location, and it seems to be a labor camp settlement that is alongside the river. So all of these important people have been taken into captivity, and as a result of that, they feel that being outside of the land, that they have no access to the presence of God. So part of this vision, I think, is to show that God's mobility is availability in the midst of even their dire circumstance of being enslaved to the Babylonians. So we might say that this vision is one of divine presence. Where can we go where God is not also available there? The psalmist talks about going to heaven or going down to Sheol, and God is already there. In other words, this is a vision of assurance that even though God is going to abandon the temple, he is yet available throughout the cosmos, and he is also available in Babylon, in this place um, of desertion in relationship to their ethnicity and their religious traditions. So the flow of this vision begins with a storm and it ends with a throne. So these seem to be the 2 points of this vision. It begins in a storm, which is going to bring us back to the way God first revealed himself. So if you were reading Exodus chapters 19 and 20, after the people of Israel come out of Egypt and they encamp in the Sinai Peninsula, God is going to show himself atop a mountain. And he calls Moses up to the top of that mountain. And as there, he's going to reveal himself to Moses. Then he gives Moses the instructions to build a tabernacle. When Moses comes down from Mount Sinai, he gives instructions to the artisans to use the materials that is told at the end of the book of Exodus in chapters 25, 26, and 30, and so forth. And then they build this construct. This tabernacle has an outer courtyard. It has a place where sacrifices can be offered. But the most important part of this tabernacle, it seems, is the Holy of Holies, because it's there you have the Ark of the Covenant and you have the presence of God that sits atop the lid of the Ark of the Covenant between the cherubim. And then this tabernacle is a mobile construct. When God is leading them through the desert, we're told in Exodus that he displays his presence by a pillar of fire at night, and that this fire is a constant reminder that he has not left them. So they follow by cloud during the day, they settle, they camp, and God's presence is felt by fire. Now, you're going to see some of that element in this vision as well, because you're going to see fire and brilliance that's a part of this. There's even the appearance of a rainbow that is mentioned as well. And that kind of takes us back to the Noahic covenant, that God was not out to destroy the world, and he makes a promise that he will never again bring a flood upon the earth. So I did a little bit of footwork on how do we conceptualize this. So in doing some research of it, if you look at the key points, you'll see it consists of living creatures, the wheels, which are an odd thing, and the throne. Those are the three key points. And if you were to ask AI, artificial intelligence, to come up with a construct or a picture that represents what's in Ezekiel chapter 1, this is what AI came up with. So if you take a look at that picture there, you're going to see several things. You're going to see four creatures, each of them having four faces. You're going to see wheels within a wheel, and you're going to see a platform with a throne on top, with one that looks like the Son of Man that's sitting on top of the throne with a rainbow over top of it. I must say, I'm pretty impressed with the details of this particular picture, artificial intelligence generated picture. And it takes all the components of Ezekiel chapter 1, and it talks about God moving, I think, beyond the confinements of the temple, and that God has no spatial limitations. Now, those of us who live in the West and have been the beneficiaries of Lutheranism, Calvinism, Protestantism, Catholicism, we already believe that God is omnipresent everywhere. But in the ancient world, there is this idea of confinement, confinement to the temple and confinement to Jerusalem. But when this vision takes place, it kind of breaks out of that confinement, and you have small little representations of it that is often found sometimes in the Psalms. And you'll find that in the Psalms, it will sometimes talk about these very things, that God sits enthroned in the heavens, or he sits among the cherubim. Even when you come to the old end of the New Testament, you have some similar imagery in the book of Revelation. The thing that's important to keep in mind is it is symbolism. There's this type of reading is something that sometimes people try to take literally, and that leads to sometimes other interpretations that I'll talk to you about in a few moments. So far, what we're talking about is Ezekiel has this vision that comes to him. Now, the other vision that you're going to find later, he is the one that's moving, he is the one that's traveling, but not in this vision. It comes to him. And as it comes to him, he describes what he saw. So let's break it down. So, three steps to this vision, all right? And I'm going to read the section, and we'll just talk a little bit about each section. So, three sections or three steps to this vision. The first one, you see a storm, you see four creatures and their appearance. So, here's what it sounds like. It says, I looked, so it goes back to the first person narrative again, after there has been a little bit of information in the third person about King Jehoiachin and him sitting by the Kebar River in the 5th month of the 5th year of the exile. Now it goes back to first person, and it says, I looked, and I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. The center of the fire looked like glowing metal, and in the fire was what looked like four living creatures. In appearance, their form was that of a man, but each of them had four faces and four wings. Their legs were straight, their feet were like those of a calf and gleamed like burnished bronze. Under their wings, on their four sides, they had the hands of a man. All four of them had faces and wings, and their wings touched one another. Each one went straight ahead, and they did not turn as they moved. Their faces looked like this. Each of the four had the face of a man, and on the right side, each had the face of a lion, and on the left, the face of an ox. Each also had the face of an eagle. Such were their faces. Their wings were spread out upward. Each had two wings, one touching the wing of another creature on either side, and two wings covering its body. Each one went straight ahead. Wherever the spirit would go, they would go, without turning as they went. The appearance of the living creatures was like burning coals of fire, or like torches. Fire moved back and forth among the creatures. It was bright, and lightning flashed out of it. The creatures sped back and forth like flashes of lightning. And as I looked, well, that's end of verse 14. So I'm going to stop right there. So go back to this, and you see four creatures here. It's a storm that comes out of the north, and these creatures are given an appearance. Now, if you were to look at these cross references, and we don't have time to do that tonight, but you would find similarities to some of the appearances of God at Mount Sinai. So if you remember in Exodus chapters 19 and 20, when God meets Moses on Mount Sinai, there is the appearance of a storm, complete with lightning and earthquake. And these appearances appear in other places as well, in Second Kings and Job and Isaiah and Jeremiah and so forth. And it seems to be a pattern that where God shows up, there is this storm that seems to be a symbol that God is holding man accountable. There's often kind of an association that there's a day of reckoning for the way they treat the planet and treat each other. So the first step is the storm and four creatures and their appearances. But what we also note is that in cross references, especially in Genesis and Isaiah 6, uh, some of the descriptions that are here also sound kind of like cherubim, angelic creatures. In Genesis, the angelic creatures after Adam and Eve are exiled out of the garden, so all of this is similar language. There is a cherubim that's put in front of the entrance to the Garden of Eden, where they're not allowed to come back into it. Isaiah, when he has his vision, he sees cherubim and seraphim in his vision. Now, there's different titles for the angelic world that's in the Bible, seraphim, cherubim. In Hebrew, cherubim is the Hebrew word that's often used, and they're often associated with guardians. Now, in Genesis, it's guarding the Garden of Eden. However, there's also this idea of protection where there's sacred mountain. Moses meets God on top of the mountain. There's also sacred trees and rivers. You see that at the end of the book of Revelation. When you look at their role, it seems as though they are throne bearers. Um, the vision in the ancient Near East is how do you carry the king to where he wants to go? Well, the vision is many times there's servants that put the king on a platform that's on their shoulders. And we've all seen that in movies and so forth. So you go back to this idea, it's kind of like the angelic world is kind of holding up the throne of God. And are guardians of his presence and so forth. So that's step number one, the description here of what seems to be an angelic realm that is connected to the presence of God. Step number two. Now there's a new element that's introduced, verses 15 through 21. As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the ground beside each creature with its four faces. This was the appearance and structure of the wheels. They sparkled like chrysolite, and all four looked alike. Each appeared to be made like a wheel intersecting a wheel. And as they moved, they would go in any one of four directions the creatures faced. Now remember, there's four faces, so they face all four directions on the compass, basically. The wheels did not turn about as the creatures went. Their rims were high and awesome, and all four rims were full of eyes all around. And when the living creatures moved, the wheels beside them moved. And when the living creatures rose from the ground, the wheels also rose. Wherever the spirit would go, they would go, and the wheels would rise along with them because the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. So it's being motivated by the spirit, the ruach in Hebrew. And when the creatures moved, they moved. And when the creatures stood still, they stood still. And when the creatures rose from the ground, the wheels rose with them because the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. Strange stuff, right? Well, what you have here, it seems to be, is the four wheels or the four corners of the heavenly chariot. And the description of them resembles some of the elements, the types of different uh, qualities that are in the materials in Solomon's temple that you find described in 1 Kings chapter 7. Each wheel is described as a wheel within a wheel. And then what's really weird about it is it's covered with eyes. Now, this particular picture here, you can see it a little bit. These little ovals here are representing eyes. Now, it could be illustrating the all-seeing nature of God, or it could be representing the fact that an eye within Hebrew could also be a description of some type of jewel as well, showing the extravagance and beauty of the throne room. But let's take it at face value for right now. Eyes kind of showing the ability to see the entire cosmos. They're facing in all four directions. That's very similar to sometimes you see in the scriptures the idea of the four winds as well. 4 points of the compass. In every direction, God sees and God moves. So step number two, these wheels are attached to the creatures. And what you have is this idea that the wheels are alive with some type of divine energy because of the proximity to the presence of God. Step number three. So now verses 22 through 27. And this will finish off the chapter here. It says here, spread out above the heads of the living creatures was what looked like an expanse, sparkling like eyes and awesome. Under the expanse, their wings were stretched out one toward the other, and each had two wings covering its body. And when the creatures moved, I heard the sound of their wings, like the roar of rushing waters, like the voice of the Almighty, like the tumult of an army. And when they stood still, they lowered their wings. An act of humility and worship, it seems. Then there came a voice from above the expanse over their heads, and as they stood with their lowered wings, above the expanse over their heads was what looked like a throne of sapphire, and high above on that throne was a figure like that of a man. I saw that from what appeared to be his waist up. He looked like glowing metal, as if full of fire. And that from there down, he looked like fire, and bright light, brilliant light surrounded him. Like the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so was the radiance around him. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell face down, and I heard the voice of one speaking. And then that's what we'll get into next week, is Ezekiel's actual calling. So you have here, finally, in verse 27, all of this seems to be illustrating what he says is the glory of the Lord, the glory of God, symbolized in these different vision elements. So this idea, remember when we studied in other episodes, we talked about how the ancient world kind of saw the world, and the idea was of different levels. You have Sheol below, you have the sky above, and then you have above the sky and above the firmament kind of this upper world where God abode. And so it seems as though even in this vision here, you have kind of three levels. You have the earth below, you have that which is above, and that which is above the expanse. Three elements to that as well. So this is how, when we watched the video last week of the summary from the Bible Project of the first part of Ezekiel. This was the image that Tim Mackey used. So you see the four images and the four faces on each creature, the wheels below, and then you have this platform, and then you have the presence and the glory of God above it. So between this and this, we probably have at least a pretty good conception of what Ezekiel saw and what he was trying to describe. Now, the hard thing is asking the question, what does all of these elements mean? Well, perhaps, here's a theory. The picture or vision of God and his throne room corresponds to the three level structure of the cosmos in the ancient mind. So when you think about what you see in Genesis, you have the skies, the land, and the waters. Sometimes it appears in other forms. You have a cosmic mountain high up. You have the Garden of Eden on earth, and then you have the land not below in the sense of waters, but the land outside the garden. What you have is a similar construction in the tabernacle and temple schematic. You have the Holy of Holies, the highest. You have the holy place, the middle place, and the courtyard, the common place. So here's another way of looking at it. So when Moses goes up to Mount Sinai to receive a vision and revelation of God, you have the base, the first level, and that's where all the people could be. Then you have the midsection where the priests and the elders are allowed to go halfway up the mountain. And then finally you hit the summit, and Moses alone is allowed to go into the presence of God. When you look at the tabernacle and temple construct, you have the courtyard, the lowest level where the people are allowed to gather, where they can offer up sacrifices. You have the holy place where the priests are allowed to go. They light the menorah, they put the showbread on the table, that type of thing. Then you have the curtain that separates the holy place and the Holy of Holies. And the high priest alone is allowed to go into the Holy of Holies. The Ark of the Covenant on the Day of Atonement is seen by the high priest alone. So you have a similar thing that is three levels. My point in this is Perhaps this vision, going back to our picture here, is the idea of three levels again, the highest being God sitting in the throne room. Okay. The other thing to keep in mind here is the temple iconography that you find here. So, in the ancient world, temples had all kinds of icons attached to them. And I'm not just talking about Jewish people, I'm talking about the entirety of the ancient Near East. You see it even in things, even in our own day. Isn't it interesting that outside the courtrooms of many places across the country, you have two lions that kind of sit uh, aside the steps that are going up into the courtroom. Iconography is communicating something without words. So often when we talk about justice, what's the iconography? You have a woman that's blindfolded holding scales. Are you following what I'm saying? Pictures that are communicating certain things. Well, that's what you're having in the ancient Near East. Different temples had different iconography and different creatures that were important to that particular people group. So before I get to the ancient interpretation alternatives, um, what I think is happening here, and maybe the safest interpretation of this really weird vision that Ezekiel has, is this is about the presence of God. And somehow it is following some of the iconography and some of the structure of not only the cosmos, but of the temple and the tabernacle as well. So let me stop there and see if you have some questions that that maybe I can help you with, maybe I can't. This is a passage of scripture that even the best of scholars scratch their heads on. But let's see if you have a question, and then I'm going to give you like four other ways that other interpreters have looked at this chapter. Okay, so do you have any thoughts, any questions at this point? Okay, all right. Let's proceed then with a couple of alternative ways of looking at this. So the first one is what is called Jewish Kabbalah. So in Jewish Kabbalah, what you have is this type of connection. I don't know if you can see it on the screen here real well or not, but different qualities that are important. And that this particular vision was to illustrate certain qualities that are important. Now, what you have as the four important symbols of Jewish Kabbalah, which is a method of interpretation, is fire, water, air, and earth. And you see a few of those in this vision. You see fire, you see the wind, the ruach, the movement of air, that type of thing. Well, all of this means something in kind of in mystical form. So every religion has its strict literalists and has mystics as well, the way they look at the world, either mystically or literally or symbolically, those type of things. So can't really tell you what all the components mean in this approach, but it's somehow a revelation of God that's supposed to inaugurate a process whereby God becomes more and more of a reality in the real world, the physical world. A second interpretation might be related to Babylonian astrology. So each of these creatures have four faces. Now, what's fascinating is Ezekiel is in exile in Babylon. And of course, he would be familiar with the way they looked at the universe. And through their belief in astrology, guess what some of the signs of the zodiac correspond to? Four corners of the earth relate to Leo the lion, Scorpio, who has a human face, Taurus the bull, and Pegasus the eagle or thunderbird. So fascinating. Some people think that this is a way of showing that God is above the um, astrological signs, the different directions of the cosmos. Each of these four creatures within Babylonian astrology are 90 degrees from each other in the sky. Um, and you have some of these elements in the chapter as well. Third alternate interpretation, and that is what is called metaphysical. So metaphysical, again, relates to this idea that you have imagery that is rooted here that is giving us a picture of something. And the term here, Merkabah, itself can be translated chariot. That this is a metaphysical representation of the chariot of God, and that he travels throughout the cosmos using his divine chariot. Um, People who seek metaphysical um, type experiences will try to recreate some of the things that Ezekiel felt in these moments. And remember, Brenda said last week, could have this been something that was drug induced? Because sometimes in religions, you do have people that will take different substances as a way of trying to bring some type of divine vision or experience, to be able to get beyond this world into the next or into the cosmos itself. So I'm not sure that any of these alternatives have a lot of weight or strength to them. But the one that a lot of people like to use is the last interpretation. Is this a description of a UFO sighting? Is Ezekiel chapter 1 describing the presence of creatures that came to Earth in something of what would look like a flying saucer? Now, believe it or not, um, a lot of people will hold to this because um, we can't make sense of it a lot of times, and they go, it's beyond us. But knowing the universe as we know it, billions and billions of galaxies and stars, it makes some logical sense to think that there is life elsewhere in the universe. Do they have the ability to visit planet Earth? That's the key question. So, what I want to do tonight is I want to have you recall some research that was done back in the 1970s. There was a guy by the name, a German guy, I think. His name was Erich von Daniken. And he was invited to NASA, where he met with another um, professional, Joseph Blumrich. And the two of them spoke about the theory that this could have been an extraterrestrial that visited the planet. And out of that, Erich von Daniken wrote a book called Chariots of the Gods. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. Back in the 70s, it was popular. Um, his basic his basic premise was Ezekiel's description was of a wheeled chariot that had landing sounds to it, like a spacecraft, wind, flashes of lightning, bright lights, all those type of things. So rather than me describing that for you, I want to show you, I think it's about a 10-minute video, and you can take this for yourself. Out of all the alternative interpretations, this will be the one that people will hold on to, other than the one that this is a description of the glory of God in symbolic form. So let's watch together. I don't have sound. That's a problem here. Might not be able to show it to you. I might have a...
When biblical writings are analyzed from this viewpoint, a compelling image arises, suggesting that our ancient forebears may have encountered an advanced civilization rather than divine beings. The ancient astronaut hypothesis posits that Ezekiel's depiction of the Merkaba, or wheeled chariot, is more plausibly understood as a spacecraft utilized by an advanced extraterrestrial civilization for interstellar travel and communication. Erich von Däniken stands out as a prominent advocate of this hypothesis, presenting a persuasive case for a different understanding of the book of Ezekiel. His argument is so convincing that it has even challenged the fundamental premise of a NASA scientist publication intended to refute his assertions. Ezekiel holds significant importance in Judaism and is also a notable figure in various other Abrahamic religious texts. He was taken to Babylon during the initial captivity of Israel and is recognized as a prophet. A distinctive feature of the book of Ezekiel is its use of the first-person pronoun I, indicating that it is a personal account authored by Ezekiel himself, in contrast to many other biblical writings that employ the third person. This first-person perspective adds a degree of authenticity and individuality to the narrative, as it recounts events shortly after they transpired. I looked, and I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning, and surrounded by brilliant light. The center of the fire looked like glowing metal, and in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance, their form was human, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight, their feet were like those of a calf, and gleamed like burnished bronze. Under their wings on their 4 sides they had human hands. All 4 of them had faces and wings, and the wings of one touched the wings of another. Each one went straight ahead. They did not turn as they moved. Ezekiel recounts witnessing a chariot with wheels descending from the heavens, operated by entities resembling humans. Although numerous biblical interpretations of this narrative identify the figure on the chariot as God, von Däniken highlights that the original Hebrew text does not reference God. This term was introduced at a later stage. Ezekiel's portrayal of the wheeled chariot's descent bears a striking resemblance to the landing of a spacecraft. The elements of a windstorm, flashes of lightning, and radiant lights evoke the imagery of a spacecraft approaching the ground, stirring up dust in a display unprecedented for an individual from such an ancient time. Furthermore, Ezekiel characterizes the fire that fuels the chariot as resembling glowing metal. There is a notable inconsistency between this description and the manner in which Ezekiel's vision is commonly depicted in biblical art. Many illustrations tend to omit crucial elements such as the fire, the all-directional wheels, and the crystalline vault that surrounds the heads of the anthropomorphic beings. As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the ground beside each creature with its 4 faces. This was the appearance and structure of the wheels. They sparkled like topaz, and all 4 looked alike. Each appeared to be made like a wheel intersecting a wheel. As they moved, they would go in any one of the 4 directions the creatures faced. The wheels did not change direction as the creatures went. Their rims were high and awesome, and all 4 rims were full of eyes all around. Spread out above the heads of the living creatures was what looked something like a vault, sparkling like crystal, and awesome. Many individuals regard the 4 beings as cherubim or angelic entities, particularly highlighted in ancient Jewish and Christian literature. These beings, described as having the appearance of a man, are theorized to be extraterrestrial in nature, who subsequently transport Ezekiel in their unidentified flying object to a temple situated atop the highest mountain. During this journey, Ezekiel notes the sensation of God's hand upon him, which may be interpreted as the gravitational forces or G-forces experienced during ascent. He is brought to the temple of these beings, which is likely a base or city where they dwell. In the 1970s, Erich von Däniken received an invitation to deliver a confidential address at NASA, where he encountered Joseph F. Blumrich. Their discussion revolved around von Däniken's ancient astronaut theory, as presented in his book, Chariots of the Gods, particularly the notion that Ezekiel's vision represented a space shuttle rather than a celestial chariot. This dialogue prompted Blumrich to embark on a quest to refute von Däniken's seemingly implausible theory, leading him to conduct his own research and begin writing a book. However, the evidence he uncovered proved to be compelling, resulting in a significant realization for Blumrich. He concluded that Ezekiel was indeed depicting an advanced spacecraft. Furthermore, Blumrich utilized Ezekiel's description of the vehicle to secure a patent for his own design of an omnidirectional wheel. Any thought of visits to our planet by extraterrestrial beings is immediately stopped by the realization that existing scientific knowledge precludes that possibility. If such visits could be made at all, they would have to originate outside our solar system, and interstellar journeys would require unimaginable lengths of time. Yet this established knowledge is confronted with the wealth of mankind's myths and legends which claim the exact opposite, that gods came from the skies. Their appearances were frequently accompanied by fire, smoke, and thunderous noise. However, their influence on man was mostly beneficial. If the source of this information is the primitive peoples, we call it a fable. When the origin lies in religious scriptures of the more developed civilizations, we interpret the tales in a more spiritual or even holy manner. That this attitude is unfair and wrong is manifest in at least two respects. It disregards the sincere and honest belief of the peoples who handed down the accounts and degrades the tales to fictional stories. At its worst, the information is dismissed as the result of hallucination, the effects of drugs, or plain invention. But this attitude is also wrong and unfair with regard to man's future development, because it denies even the possibility of progress in the corresponding fields of science. Thus, we seem to be at an impasse because of an apparent conflict between science and legend. Yet the way is not totally blocked. We can make progress in this very important field of knowledge once we realize that science and engineering are two separate, although not independent, activities, each with its own area of significance. We must acknowledge the present inability of science to help formulate answers to the question of extraterrestrial visitors, while realizing that engineering and industrial technology have not been introduced to the controversy. The participation of engineers becomes an unconditional requirement in the evaluation of configurations and phenomena implying visits from other worlds. Here, it is only natural that our fledgling knowledge concerning spaceflight emerges as a contributor of prime significance. My own involvement in the subject of extraterrestrial visitors began with a vehemently negative attitude. Having worked as an aeronautical engineer since 1934, first in the design and analysis of aircraft, then for the past 15 years in the design and development of both launching vehicles and spacecraft, I was firmly entrenched in the camp of those who declare visits from outer space to be an impossibility. It was in this frame of mind that I began to read Erich von Däniken's Chariots of the Gods. His claim that the prophet Ezekiel had encounters with spaceships prompted me to read the biblical book of Ezekiel carefully with the intention of proving von Däniken wrong. By the time I had got to verse 7 of the very first chapter, however, I found myself interpreting a description of the landing's legs of some kind of flying vehicle. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were round, and they sparkled like burnished bronze. Having designed and tested such structures myself, I could not deny that it was possible to read in this a direct yet simple technical description. The contrast of that evidently clear passage with the quite hazy pictures sketched by the rest of the chapter made me realize that the prophet could not have known what it was he had seen, or could not have understood it. I realized the necessary consequences of this. The prophet could only describe his encounters with space vehicles and their crews in the terms available to him, with words and comparisons familiar to him and his contemporaries. So I began taking Ezekiel seriously, in an engineering sense. Because I had to rely on translations, I used 6 different Bibles, ranging in time from early in the last century to 1972, edited by Jewish, Roman Catholic, and Protestant translators. Besides these, I used 2 highly detailed biblical commentaries. My application of aircraft, specifically helicopter, and spacecraft engineering principles to the reports of the prophet resulted in the penetration of Ezekiel's visual descriptions and the replacement of these by known structural configurations. The final result is shown by the drawing at the beginning of this paper. There we see a quasi-conical main body supported by 4 helicopter units, which carries the command capsule atop its rounded upper portion. We should consider that Ezekiel first saw this vehicle at a distance of about 1,000 meters at the moment the nuclear engine fired, probably with some white clouds of condensation because of the engine's chill-down phase, shooting past the craft's main body. As for the likeness of the living creatures, their appearance was like burning coals of fire, and like the appearance of lamps. It went up and down among the living creatures, and the fire was bright, and out of the fire went forth lightning. In these fiery dynamic surroundings, Ezekiel notices the moving rotors and sees the landing legs and mechanical arms attached to the helicopter units. His first reaction is to compare the helicopters with man-like figures, but he then finds in the term living creatures an expression of admirable vagueness to reflect his uncertainty. During final descent and landing, Ezekiel observes the protective covers of the helicopter's gear mechanisms, which he is able to describe best by comparing them with human faces. He notices the red-hot radiator, glowing coals, covering part of the lower central body. The prophet is fascinated by the wheels, which, in their basic form, are the only element he recognizes and thus describes in great detail. The visual description of the wheel has been misinterpreted in numerous paintings and texts, yet no one has ever taken seriously the functional description which indicates that the wheels could move in any direction without being turned or steered. The latter has led me to develop a precise engineering interpretation, and for which a patent was granted. A particularly gratifying application of this interpretation, incidentally, would be to facilitate considerably the mobility of wheelchairs for the physically handicapped. Ezekiel ends his technical description with comments on the command capsule and on the commander himself. The amount of detail he includes is astounding. It is significant that the prophet describes features which are of little engineering importance, but which, to the eye, carry the same weight as true structural elements. The quasi-conical shape of the spacecraft's central body, ideally suited to permit its combination with the helicopters, and thus a most important feature of the vehicle, is an existing engineering product. It was developed at the Langley Research Center of NASA, and has been studied analytically and in a series of wind tunnel tests. After establishing the general configuration of the spaceship, I made an analytical investigation. Although the configuration appeared to be structurally and functionally sound, its feasibility could be proved only if weights, dimensions, performance, and other basic characteristics turned out to be within reasonable limits. The analysis was performed parametrically. That means dimensions, weights, and performance were varied in steps over a wide range of possibilities. From the first crude calculation to the final detailed analysis, the results left no doubt of the vehicle's feasibility. They reveal a general technology of spacecraft construction not far beyond our current most advanced capabilities. The only element we are incapable of building is the nuclear reactor within the propulsion system. Although this would be a fission reactor, it would require a specific impulse of at least 2,000 seconds against the about 900 seconds of today's nuclear engines. It is reasonable to assume, however, that we could have this capability within a few decades if we were to invest enough effort in its development. The overall result, then, is a space vehicle technically feasible beyond doubt and very well designed to suit function and purpose. Its technology is in no way fantastic, but, even in its extreme aspects, lies almost within our own capabilities of today. The results indicate, moreover, that Ezekiel's spacecraft operated in conjunction with a mother vessel orbiting the Earth. We have no point of firm reference for an exact determination of the dimensions of the landing craft, but we can approximate these within the range I investigated analytically. This illustration shows the shape and proportions. The diameter of the central body would be about 18 meters. The rotor of a helicopter unit would be 11 meters. Total weight from the time of liftoff from the Earth for the return flight to the mother ship would be 110 tons. The engine's specific impulse would be 2,080 seconds, and the craft would carry 2 or 3 passengers. With these conclusions, I had to declare defeat. I wrote to Erich von Däniken, explaining that my attempt to refute his theory had resulted in a structural and analytical confirmation of a major part of his hypothesis. Determining the form, dimensions, and functional capabilities of what Ezekiel saw makes understandable a number of passages in his text that are otherwise meaningless. It also aids considerably in separating the prophetic or visionary parts of Ezekiel's book from those concerning encounters with spaceships. Being an engineer, I am not qualified to investigate the non-engineering portions. Ezekiel was surely a man of high intelligence, gifted with rare powers of observation. He had the incredible ability to keep his intellect unimpaired by the emotional turmoil caused by the first encounter. Yet he was in a condition of shock by the time he observed the commander of the vessel. Ezekiel wrote that it took him 7 days to recover from the experience. One could therefore expect him to say that he had seen God, and that God spoke to him, yet he compared the figure of the commander to that of Adam, or man, and very soberly says, "One spoke to me." Never in all his encounters with the commander and other members of the crew does he show any reverence. The information conveyed by Ezekiel leads us to conclude that he came in contact with part of an expeditionary force. There are unmistakable suggestions of rank, formal communication, and organization. This, combined with the assumption that extraterrestrial civilizations too would have to have economic control of activities they undertake, leads us to surmise that even for financial reasons, Ezekiel cannot have been the sole purpose and target of the enterprise. With such notions, however, I obviously begin to leave the territory of provable engineering affirmations. For several reasons, I conclude that Ezekiel's encounters with spaceships and his prophecies do not coincide in time. He could have seen the space vessel on one day and have had his prophetic experiences months or even years later. Yet the commander spoke to the prophet. We know from the history of the biblical book of Ezekiel that it was edited some time after it had been written. Several points of my engineering investigation show that editing to have been done with complete honesty and truthfulness, although the lack of knowledge of what Ezekiel really meant becomes evident in some places. We are justified to assume, consequently, that some of the commander's sayings may be contained in what we now consider as Ezekiel's visions and prophecies. It would be of very great interest, of course, to have these non-technical parts of the book of Ezekiel searched accordingly. Since his revelations were written down long before the advent of flying machines or rockets, the only way man could interpret Ezekiel's enigmatic statements was through religion, and especially mysticism. The application of engineering knowledge leaves no voids in the text's interpretation. nor does it require any force to achieve agreement. Attempts to explain the same phenomena by vision, hallucination, or psychological or astrological effects requires one to accept a long series of coincidences. These would be necessary indeed to substantiate the congruities which I have established technically. Today's established position concerning visitors from beyond the earth can be summed up by the statement, "We do not know where they came from and how they arrived here, so they cannot have been here." With time, the evidence will grow into a more understandable pattern, so that we can then declare, "They were here, so they must have come here." Advanced technology provides a means to make progress in this field, and I hope to stir enough interest in other engineers, not only design and structural specialists, to perform similar studies. And we cannot work for long without the support of scientists, physicists, archaeologists, and ethnologists. What is needed foremost is open-minded cooperation, and I plead for that.
Okay, well, I thought that was an interesting approach to the text, and I hope you found that to be so as well. So let's bring everybody back up on screen and ask if you have any thoughts, questions, or reflections to chapter 1 of Ezekiel before we finish our night together. Is there anything that you'd like to talk about tonight? It's a lot to take in, isn't it?
I wish I could ask my dad about that, but I can't.
Yeah. Yep. All right. Well, if something to chew on, right? So
Yeah.
we'll try to use chapter 1 in connection with Ezekiel's call. We'll take a look at chapters 2 and 3 next week and see how maybe it correlates with what is in chapter 1. But hey, whether we can understand it or not, it's great theater, isn't it? So
Yep,
enjoy
it
it.
is.
Okay?
Yep.
All right. Have a good evening, everybody. We'll
All
see
right.
you
You
soon.
too.
Okay.
Night.
Take
Stay
care.
warm.
Bye.
Bye.
The snack time. Come on, guys, let's go.
It won't let me leave. That's weird.